Okay, everybody, welcome to this episode of the Benjamin Anthony Show here at the MirYam Institute. I'm your host, Benjamin Anthony, and as ever, I'm delighted to provide you with analysis and conversation and commentary about the matters that seem to be most pressing of the day. And it's a high privilege to be joined by my colleague here at the MirYam Institute, our expert on urban warfare, but also the preeminent commentator on all things related to modern war, I would suggest, John Spencer. John, great to have you with me.
Thanks for having me back, Benjamin.
My pleasure. So I want to begin, John, by diving into the issue of Iran. Now, there are a lot of people who saw the uprisings and saw the revolts and saw the people take to the street last week. And that was, in addition to President Trump really putting out very, very clear messaging through social media about the fact that he wanted people to continue to take to the streets. He wanted people to continue to make their voices heard. And that came with an assurance that help was on the way. I'm paraphrasing, but I'm sure that everybody listening to this has looked on and seen the wording and the phrasing to which I'm referring, and help has not yet come. And there are a lot of people who are talking about the idea that the president may have missed his moment, that the momentum has died down as the protests have died down, that the opportunity, the window for him to launch a strike, whether that be in order to facilitate more effective an uprising, or whether it be to take out some of the military strongholds of the Iranians, or whether it indeed be to topple the supreme leader, that moment has passed. Now, I'd just like to get your thoughts on it, and then I'll come back with some of mine.
Sure. And there's a lot there, actually, going back to really the 12-day war and why was this uprising different than even, which I watched closely and was supporting in 2022, the Women Like Freedom protest in Iran that were pretty big. This is, but at a scale that we probably haven't seen in the last 48 years, really. And you have to answer why. I definitely attribute that to Israel's success during the 12-day war of not only the reduction of IRGC commanders, over 20 plus commanders, they hit, of course, but also the regime's arms like the besieged headquarters, police headquarters, all of the devices that since Iran doesn't invest in its economy, it was running out of water, potentially having to move Tehran. Really going back to the 12-day war, it's really significant, I think, in what we've seen. But fine, the uprising started really when the Iranian basically dollar crashed and the economic situation just continues. Blackouts of electricity all throughout the day. If you want to say what's the trigger now, but also all these contributing factors like the 12-day war, the uprisings rose. And then, yes, unlike, again, going back to the past protests, the president said that he was in support if the mullah regime starts executing. But now we're up, reports, which is also for me as an analyst, very interesting how the world will believe Hamas's Gaza Health Ministry, every number to the single digit. Mainstream media is questioning, in the variety of numbers, but all the way up to 16,000 killed, 300,000 injured during the regime's crackdown of the protest. And the president, though, saying the United States president, that has to stop or else, which is, President Trump speaks in very declarative, unique way to probably any U.S. president in history. But I do understand the idea of help is on the way. But when we start to do this really, geopolitical analysis, but also closed door, what people are going to know in the open source versus what's going on behind closed doors. And there was this, even conversation that Israel requested that the United States not do a strike, which you do have to go back to the 12-day war and look at, while what was in position in for Israel to defend itself against the ballistic missiles, the drones, and everything was a lot of also stuff on the ground. Of course, Israel's tiered air defense system, but aircraft carriers, United States aircraft in the air, just so much preparation. And there were still 38 ballistic missiles that made it through Israel. And as you saw during this time when the president is making this, the supreme leader and others start making threats not only to the United States bases in the Middle East, but also Israel, which I do factor in. Okay, that's a clear like variable. And yes, I know what the president's saying, and I would love. And I made a tweet about like what kind of support could the United States send, and we have to be careful that the people who say the United States has done nothing, because there's always covert things that's going on that we don't even know, whether that's cyber attacks, whether that is the increase of Starlink terminals, direct communication. Of course, you have the Crown Prince of Iran, Pahlavi, meeting with U.S. leadership, other leaders, and sending messages to the protesters like this is your moment. So I'm really careful to say that there has been no help sent, but as a U.S. especially analyst, there was a clear um, limitation on what the U.S. was going to be able to do, not only in kinetic direct action if that decision was made. And the president always, as you've seen, even during the 12-day war, will make political statements saying you have until this date to do something. And for Iran, it was, give up their nuclear weapons and all these things before other actions are taken. That's really one of his leadership styles. So the fact that there was no aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean or in the Middle East, really, to be able to support or even help defend U.S. bases in the Middle East, let alone Israel, was a significant limitation to the United States' ability to do what? Everybody wants to see, direct strikes against the regime, even if it's the regime, IRGC, Besiege, and others cracking down on the protest. But the USS Abraham Lincoln was then during this time, and we're talking 2 weeks, was shifted. And that's a major move for the United States to shift an aircraft carrier strike group, move it into position, and how long it takes about a week to get into position to set. For me, I think, and why we haven't seen, like where you said you would help. Of course, the president says he talked to Iran. They had 831 executions scheduled and they stopped those. And there's a lot of behind the scenes things we're not seeing. But as a military, like, why aren't you doing something? Is to have offensive and defensive capabilities in the region beyond what's already there in all those U.S. bases and all that Israel is able to do. I think that was a really important moment, and there are still protests going on. There's still, of course, a blackout that the Islamic regime is trying to impose on Iran. I don't, well, some people have this feeling that we saw the kind of the high water mark. I don't believe so. I saw, the banks burning in Tehran as of right before our meeting. The protests are still happening, increasing the ability for that information to get out to the world, but also for us having the carrier strike group in the region is critical for even U.S. interests, but also I think Israel interest in being able to make, deterrence is about having the ability to have the political will to do something, but also have the actual capability to do something. And both those are really important in this situation. I'm hopeful that we haven't seen the true end of the protest, and that will continue to build as the Iranian people have made a clear statement, unlike I think even in the past protest, thanks to some of these, even if some people are saying, well, that's not, he's saying something, he's not doing anything, but these are credible support to the protesters that they didn't have in the past. Ultimately, and I know that was a long answer, Benjamin. Um, People always say if the Iranian people want to overthrow the regime, they should do that. But if you understand what the regime invests in, of course, the regime invests in a ballistic missile program to be able to attack Israel. It invests in a nuclear program to be able to attack Israel and then the rest of who it views as its enemies, the entire world. It also invests heavily in the crackdown on the population to prepare for moments like this. And protesters don't have access to arms, and that's really the biggest thing. If on a kind of an aside of there is no armed uprising that can happen, and there are millions of Iranians that are protesting at the threat of death with no ability to actually protect themselves and to actually do a revolution because of how much work has been done since 1979 to prevent ever happening again.
Yeah, I appreciate all of that, John. And I think I'd like to, first of all, just express that I'm in complete agreement with you. And I said at the top that the help that people have presumed is coming has not yet arrived. But that doesn't mean by any stretch of the imagination that there is no help that's already been deployed to Iran and to the Iranian people. I completely agree with that. I also think that when it comes to this idea that Prime Minister Netanyahu has asked Donald Trump not to strike Iran in whichever way, shape, or form that ultimately takes, if it does come to pass, because Israel is not prepared and not ready to defend itself in the event that Iran retaliates against Israel, as it has said that it will do if America does strike. That's one claim. The other claim that's come about is that the Israelis looked at the Pentagon's planning for this strike and they said that it's not sufficient to bring about an outcome that would be in the interests of Israel or the United States of America or in pursuit of America's broader goals there in Iran. Now, the reason I mentioned both of those two is, as you've alluded to, nobody knows what the actual internal conversations are at that level. What I do know, however, John, and I hope you'll agree with me, is that prior to the 12-day war, prior to Midnight Hammer, there was a very successful, very effective disinformation campaign that was put forward by the Trump administration and by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that really sowed the seeds in people's minds of the idea that these two leaders had fallen out one with the other, that they didn't see eye to eye, that they were angry with one another, they were no longer able to coordinate and to communicate. And so I'm rather hopeful that all of these rumors about who has asked for the Americans to stay their hand are another aspect of this very effective disinformation campaign, which showed us that when they wish to do so, President Trump, Prime Minister Netanyahu, America and the Israelis, the American military and the Israeli military are able to coordinate very, very well indeed around a cause, around a strike, around an operation that ultimately benefits not only those two protagonists, the Americans and the Israelis, but also the broader region. So that's what I would say with regard to the rumors about the conversation. In terms of force buildup, I do want people to be aware of what is being sent to the region, because I think you're absolutely correct when you say that these things, of course, take time. The turning around of an aircraft carrier, in this case, the Abraham Lincoln carrier, that obviously, I mean, there are metaphors named after the process of turning an aircraft carrier around and how slow that action is. But to give people a little bit of context about what is currently underway, there are U.S. jets that have landed in an Air Force base inside Jordan. 12 F-15s have landed. They were sent over there from the UK, incidentally, alongside, together with fueling capabilities that are necessary for any strike in the event that one is launched. CENTCOM has added massive aerial capabilities to the American bases in Qatar, Kuwait, and the UAE. The Patriot missiles, these are the defensive mechanisms that the Americans have. Those have been deployed to protect the 40,000 approximately US military personnel that are stationed in those same three areas in Qatar, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates. As you said, the Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier is expected to arrive in the region in about 4 days from now, John. And on it, it is rumored to have 90 combat aircraft, that's planes and choppers, or jets and choppers rather. There are 3 warships that have Tomahawk launching capabilities, in addition to American submarines that are now in the area. Of course, there are reconnaissance flights going backwards and forwards almost without pause. And most ominously, I would say, there is now the movement of the B-2 and the B-52 bombers from Diego Garcia. And none of that is seen to be ordnance that would be required for a land invasion. Now, the aspects of a land invasion, or rather the absence of planning for a land invasion, is important because we know that on many of the right wing, dare I say, virulently anti-Israel podcasts, there is a constant fear mongering about the idea that any military action by the Americans will inevitably drag American service personnel into a situation where America sends boots on the ground into a given theater. The force buildup that I've just described, in my estimations, does not speak to any planning whatsoever for such an invasion, namely a ground invasion in Iran. I'd like you to come back on that in just a moment and speak to the listeners about that particular point. And also, when it comes to force buildup, of course, I reach back to my own experience here in Israel. You know, we all saw the October 7th massacre, and there were 400,000 reservists. Estimates vary a little bit, but at the top end, it's about 400,000 reservists who were mobilized in the wake of that atrocity. Now, many of those reservists, incidentally, didn't even wait to be drafted. They just went to the line and readied themselves for combat. But that's in a country the size of Israel. And even then, it takes several weeks to get your personnel, to get your military up, running, and capable of advancing into enemy territory. So I actually don't believe at all that President Trump has missed his moment. I actually believe very firmly that a force buildup like the one I've just described, and again, I'd like to know your thoughts on this, that's not the kind of force buildup that speaks to a loss of momentum. In actual fact, that's a force buildup that creates a momentum all of its own. And ultimately, the president will be able to decide what he does and does not want to do with that. I also will say that I think that the president is very, very aware of the efforts he must make to distinguish himself from individuals such as his predecessor, President Barack Obama, who our listeners will famously remember drew a bright red line and said, and I'm paraphrasing, that if we see with regard to Syria, a whole bunch of chemical weapons being moved around, that would be a red line for us, and that would change our calculus. These being the words of President Obama. So I look at all of that. Donald Trump wanting to continue to distinguish himself from someone like Obama, who drew a red line that then faded to pink and ultimately white and then was erased completely. Him having the capabilities and the force buildup that is underway, the time that those naturally take in order to take form and fashion and position, all of that leads me to say we just don't know. But if the command does come down the chain to move forward, the ordnance will be there local to the area. What do you think?
It's a great conversation that I deal with, and only when I'm talking to a true expert that would understand. We live in this world, and I do as well, where people will track whether that's airspace movement or individual things. And there's this true belief that people can see and know what's happening when there is actually benefits to classified operational security. You're right to mention what I would call deception operations. Even during the 12-day war, when the United States made a decision, it even launched aircraft going in the wrong direction. And of course, the world, all these people with watchers seeing it going in that direction, make all of these assumptions about what's happening. But you're right, there are real force buildups that need to happen. And I would point even to the Abraham Lincoln, and I did this even my time in the Pentagon as an Army land power guy. I understand actually, the movement and the buildup of a division and a recall and mobilization. I had to learn a lot about the joint force of what is a carrier strike group and like what is in that package. It's not one, it's hundreds actually of ships. It's battle cruisers, it's destroyers, it's lots of things centered around that main platform, which is the aircraft carrier, about force projection around the world to give a capability. But it's an immense package that actually does include a little bit of land-based, basic littoral capability, Marines and things like that. But this was the question I actually got on the news too. Is like, could you strike? I mean, the United States is the only military in the world that can project force power around the world. You're right. It will be a certain type of force power. Whether that's we can put a whole division of soldiers anywhere in the world within 18 hours. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
China can't do that. Russia can't do that. So when people try to discount, but also when you talk about offensive capabilities versus defensive capabilities, it's absolutely right to talk about force buildup and what is the realm of possible. What are the risks? Because really, when you're talking at this level, whether it's Israel's leadership, both military and political, or the United States, and that's not, these aren't the only players. So I would actually say force buildup also includes political force buildup, communicating to all of these other countries that could be really, based on the recklessness that we've seen the Islamic regime in Iran do in the past, impacted. So as the United States, as one of the global leaders, of course, they are working furiously about political force buildup of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, all the Egypt, all these other countries that would be involved if there was another reckless attack by the Islamic regime, in order to try to save itself internally, to focus efforts externally. It is about that buildup. You're right. People need to understand what that is, where are the gaps for, and who is it impacting. But it's also, you have to do the political, even what's going on in Davos. It isn't what the public statements that are being made right now, or it is the behind the scenes work, because some of this is actually face to face. And you see, even since the protest, a lot of individual actors in different locations in the Middle East who are doing part of this buildup that is beyond what some people like to minimize, in counting aircraft, counting certain capabilities in the region, that you could start to piece together on. Even during, Israel, since October 7th, they said that, General Krulak, the CENTCOM commander, needed an apartment in Israel based on how much time he was spending. Um, and nobody knows what's going on behind the scenes. And that's why things that look easy, as an expert, are not easy. So the amount of, yes, we can project power immediately. But the amount of work and planning that has to be done, and the second, third order thinking of getting all of these countries, all of these capabilities, together, is not an easy process. And why, yes, talking about what we know, you're right to point out that there's clearly probably some deception operations in what we know, what the mainstream media reports, going on, even within Iran, like you said, of what's been sent, what's happening. It isn't a very deductive, and simple conversation to have, and why our conversations like these are really important.
Yeah, it's also worth looking back at some of the successes of the president. He's often ridiculed by those who oppose him, but he's had great successes when he's given warnings and when he's not given warnings. The taking of Maduro, for example, would be one such success. Operation Midnight Hammer would be another such success. The killing of Qasem Soleimani would be another success. But there's another aspect to Donald Trump that, of course, goes back to his life prior to entering into public office, and that's the businessman, the deal maker. It's I would say it is not almost is it is cliched to talk about him in that context, but it's cliched because it seems to be the way in which he repeatedly acts and behaves. There's always the possibility that he'll strike a deal. That's not something that is beyond the realm of our imagination. And finally, with regard to the force buildup, and then I want to turn to what's going on in Davos for our next segment. When you think about that force buildup, I'm again reminded of what it actually is in sort of colloquial terminology, John. It's a flex. It's a flex, and whether or not it's actually going to be used may depend on the mindset of the president at that time. It may depend on what the Iranians decide to do when they're confronted by this massive, massive buildup that they're now facing. It will definitely have the fullest attention of the mullahs in Iran and everybody in the region. And I remember it here again, to go back to my own experience living here in Israel, the number of times on the Gazan front where we would see a massive attack by Hamas by way of rocket fire into the state of Israel. And successive prime ministers at various points would have an enormous buildup of the reservists. I'm talking about, obviously, in situations and operations prior to October the 7th. The troops would be massed on the borders, and then ultimately there'd be some sort of ceasefire that was struck, and the ground forces were never set in. So I'm more than familiar with the time it takes to have a force buildup, albeit not on the scale that the Americans are able to marshal, nothing even close to that. And also knowing and understanding that the buildup of that force does not mean the deployment and the actioning of that force. But also, these things, as I've said, they do take time. Now, I want to turn, if I may, John, to the Board of Peace announcement and ceremony that's going on in Davos, Switzerland, almost as we speak. Incidentally, we're recording this podcast on Thursday, January the 22nd, for context. So on Thursday, January 22nd, President Trump went and announced this the formation of the Board of Peace. Taking to the podium were himself, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Special Advisor Jared Kushner, and the president was flanked by a number of what he called world leaders. But in truth, it's a bit of a B team, isn't it, really, that's there on stage with him?
It is these major forums, while again I like to analyze the conversations that are going on off the stage, while understanding that there is a political reason for everything that's going on the stage. And you're right. And there's so much you just said that people have tried to analyze, and um, as a military analyst, you always want to list your assumptions and going into a planning hierarchy. And I think this is where the world is getting wrong, is that they're carrying pre-October 7th, pre Donald Trump assumptions into their lens in which they look at the world today. You're trying to figure out the Trump doctrine, the way he operates. You're right about the art of the deal, the economic aspects to it, but also the real and what we've seen now, especially the framework in Israel change. The true definition of peace through strength is about that deterrence theory, and not living in the past, like you highlighted, of enemies of the world, especially the Islamic regime, pride themselves in testing the will of the international community, of Israel, United States, everybody, to see where those real political lines are. And I think those assumptions are gone. Even the boots on the ground that you mentioned, President Trump was very clear, and the operation in Venezuela was very clear. Like, I'm not scared of putting boots on the ground. I had boots on the ground. It is what are they there for? And if anything that anybody has learned is you should take President Trump seriously when he makes a threat. Yes, he does go kind of full ratchet in order to get to a position that he is seeking. But also those on the stage, which there have been a lot of surprises even for me, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, even the process in which the peace board, which is associated with the Gaza peace plan, but seems to be, just based on the invitations, much bigger for President Trump, as he's seen credibly the complete dysfunction of the United Nations in achieving its goal, which is to maintain peace in the world, let alone in the Middle East, which is a part of that. So yes, some of those people individually, we could talk about them, that are on the stage in Davos are for political theater, but also for really a future in which most people aren't acknowledging happening. Thanks to Israel, the Middle East has been rewritten, but also in historic U.S. changes to the previous assumptions, whether that's economic deals, or posture deals, or where action will be taken or not taken. Midnight Hammer, of course, being probably at the top of that list, but there have been plenty of others. As in, this isn't the old United States. This isn't the old way of doing things. This isn't the old United Israel in containment theory, the rocket diplomacy. Of course, Israel is in a state where it will strike any threat, whether that's in Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, that it views as a credible threat, and that's historic, and should be talked about. Davos is a testing of this new world order that I believe has been established, and where old ways of doing things and just talk isn't what President Trump is and the administration is interested in, and arguably Israel as well.
Yeah, I think with regard to what you're saying, John, I very much believe that with President Trump at the helm, specifically that president, we are in the era of what I would call interest-based diplomacy or transactional diplomacy. One can apply the moniker that one would want to that. I think that we saw that to great effect during his previous administration when he managed to broker, of course, the Abraham Accords. And it was all interest-based and it was all transactional. And then there was the worry about what was in those transactions and from an Israeli perspective, what the implications of those transactions might be. That you'll remember that there were the fighter jets, for example, that were supposed to be supplied, and there was Israeli objection to that. I definitely believe that we're in that age and we're in that era. And I absolutely second the idea that, and I'm not saying anything original here at all, that the United Nations is completely dysfunctional, completely ineffective. And in terms of what they planted here and what they were working with here inside the Gaza Strip, downright dangerous and terror affiliated, the terror facilitating in far too many cases. But, John, you will remember that Senator John McCain floated the idea as a result of the dysfunction of the United Nations that it was time to establish what he called a League of Democracies. Do you remember that? And we all understood why. The idea was that there were too many blocks within the United Nations that could not cohere one with the other, and that you needed a clear, singular worldview that was prevalent within the member nations that would really be the governing worldview for that international organization that, as I said, he wanted to call the League of Democracies. Of course, it never got off the ground. And so I think that there is a real problem here with the Board of Peace, and I will explain it thus. Firstly, it includes, certainly by way of invitation, if not by accepted invitation, member states that do not belong in the same organization, one with the other. There is an idea, for example, that Vladimir Putin has been invited to take up membership in this Board of Peace. It gives and it confers. I mean, just to finish that point for a moment, obviously Vladimir Putin is not somebody who ought to be the recipient of anything that gives him any stature on any board known as the Board of Peace. People are going to obviously object to that. Erdogan has been invited to be part of this. Benjamin Netanyahu has been invited to be part of this and has said that he will be part of this. And those two do not go together. Of course, I back Prime Minister Netanyahu any day against somebody like Erdogan, who I view as a complete tyrant and a double-dyed unmasked anti-Semite and hater of Zion and Israel. But they don't belong together. And in addition to that, it does confer almost unbridled, unchecked power on President Donald J. Trump, not on the President of the United States of America, whomever that should be, but on President Donald J. Trump, who can only be replaced by way of incapacitation, it seems, and a couple of other provisos that are there in the charter. So I think that it's a little bit ill-fated, to say the least. I'm not overly enthusiastic about it, and I do not like the fact that it is something that has grown out of trying to resolve the situation between Israel and Hamas inside the Gaza Strip. And it's grown out of that based on the idea that there's this inexorable arrival at success between Israel and Hamas, namely peace inside this part of the world. And we're a far cry from that. Hamas has not disarmed. It's not agreed to disarm. We don't have all of the hostages back. Rangvili is still there. We believe he's in the possession of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, but it's certainly Hamas who are responsible for anything and everything that goes on inside the Gaza Strip. The Rafah crossing is not yet opened. I personally don't ever want to see that crossing opened, but it's not yet opened. I don't think Israel can allow it to be opened. Whether or not that happens, time will tell. There are just a lot of problems. The idea of a $1 billion buy-in for perpetual membership of this Board of Peace, again, is very, very difficult. And the last thing I will say is, again, having read the charter, it does begin as almost an airing of grievances against an unnamed organization, which is quite clearly the United Nations. And I want to emphasize, rightly so, grievances should be leveled against the United Nations, but it's a rather unending series of grievances. And then they've gone and invited countries who wield veto power within the United Nations Security Council, countries such as France, such as Britain, such as China, others, right? these people, knowing that they have this veto power, are very unlikely to join a board of peace that clearly is set up to be a rival to the United Nations. And the final point I will say is, of course, tragically, Europe's completely lost its way. So this idea of John McCain's that the League of Nations would somehow be bound by a common governing ideology, that really faded into the past quite a while ago.
Absolutely. Benjamin, there's so much there. And as somebody who taught strategy at West Point, I mean, we could do multiple lessons of a 40 lesson plan. And one of the ones I always start off with in strategy was the interest. You mentioned transactional diplomacy. If we actually define diplomacy, I think that's where we've gotten to this place in the world where diplomacy is just talking. And there's a really great article by Victor David Hanson about this. How did we get here? How did we get to this crippled global ideals of the way things are done? And that diplomacy is always about sovereign nations having interest of survival and then working your way down this hierarchy of interest. Of course, Israel's usually in the fight of survival, even in the defunct attacks on its legitimization. But all of that you just said is valid criticism. I agree that the administration and you've almost built the United Nations by design to now be ineffective outside of those ranking members of the UN Security Council's ability to have that veto power. But those countries and there's no way to undo that, right? So the fact that Russia has the Soviet Union seat, the way the charter was written, there was no way to undo, even if somebody becomes the actual aggressor of disorder and not pursuing peace. There's no way to undo it. It is frustrating to see that this is the vehicle which is used when there's real solutions that need to be made in something at the grander scale. Is not that big of a actual, the solutions for Gaza aren't as macro as now the peace board with all these members. And I agree, the fact that President Putin being invited is it is very frustrating understanding how he has done to rewrite the global international order in a negative way, not in a positive way, with sovereignty and laws of war and everything. How you would invite that into even if you're trying to build a new order, you're right on the League of Democracies, which I believe is actually a true pursuit. And yet, if you look at like the Abraham Accords and other forums that are being built, they are not just more forums in which we talk, but things will actual things that are tangible, whether that's economic, diplomacy, and others. This is what I think Victor David Hanson was writing about, that 40 years of academia and multinational organizations having these assumptions that the way ahead is always shared power, no matter the investment of power, which it gets to that rightful criticism of President Trump at Davos and other forums. Like, look, this game that you've been playing where everybody has the same voice, the same shared power, but not even the shared defense of their own countries and resting on other people's capabilities is over. And that's been a big part of, I agree with a lot of these very macro changes that need to be had, while individual nations, and so happy to see the debunking of the other analysts' assumptions about Israel supposedly becoming a pariah, isolating itself on the international stage when it's making historic deals with Germany, India, Azerbaijan, you name it, because this new international relations theory of no, there actually is something to peace through strength, economic vitality, all of these things where everybody doesn't have the same voice. That's not the way the world works. It never was supposed to work that way. And to build these organizations where nothing gets done. And I think just taking Israel and the United States and what they've been able to achieve in the last 2.5 years is a manifesto of the old system wasn't working. Now we see new systems being developed, and we can disagree about definitely as much as we can know in the open, Turkey, Pakistan, Russia being involved in that. I agree, though, we can't discount powers of the world. We can minimize invitations on being a part of a certain conversation because there is this two-sidedness. We need to hold everybody accountable. And that's what they always are trying to do with the United States, hold us accountable supposedly on the international stage while letting other countries like Turkey, Russia say one thing, do another, Pakistan, another, their support for terrorism. Of course, we want to isolate Iran and what it was trying to do in the Middle East, but also globally. And you build this Sunni belt around it. I'm actually in a favor of that. This is the higher level conversation. You're right, but I haven't seen enough coming out of what the peace board's charter and actual what it will do. Yes, the Gaza Executive Board is another conversation to be had about that forming, Israel being a part of that as the neighbor and the actual blood that has been spilled to achieve the peace that is there at the moment, being a part of that conversation and seeing what is happening play out, right? And this is the higher level conversations that must be had um, to understand what's going on behind the scene. What is the true intent, as you said, with the American doctrine and the American diplomacy that's happening? Play out into tangible, whether that's treaties, accords, economic deals, and membership in an organization. What does that truly mean in this hierarchy? Of course, the American first interest, that is, if you're an American audience, but for Israel or whoever you are, where you stand is where you sit. What does it mean for said country? Like, what do you get out of that? What do you get out of board membership in this peace organization, or does it get renamed eventually and it has nothing to do with the Gaza hierarchy of, but or does it? In the groups, which I have been a big fan of from the moment the Trump 20-point peace plan was discussed, I actually agreed to make a big tent, bring those countries in because they have ownership of things that are very important in the interest of the Middle East, in the interest of Israel, in the interest of the United States economic vitality in the region, because there's always what is in it for me, a part of this conversation. I just don't know if we have enough information, Benjamin, at this moment to say that's bad. Of course, in these democracies, that's what you do is you argue what you know. As we see this play out, even in Secretary Rubio's visits and what he is saying, because I think that's the other foundation as well into this new order, even within the United States. We've done so much in just a year that the dust is unable to see what the next 3 years will be, as we have even in our whether that's USAID and other things that we have, 66 organizations that we have removed ourselves from within the United Nations. Those are just UN organizations, but the others that are very positive signs towards creating this new, really global outlook, and then having others be a part of that outlook, I think is important. But I'm also a massive fan of the idea of sovereignty of nations, the idea of the global international orders, the rules of can and can't do. And this is where the criticism, we won't have time, I'm sure, about Venezuela of a U.S. law enforcement operation. But not carrying forward all of your assumptions, whether you're in Israel or whether you're in the United States or in Iran, don't carry forward your assumptions because you're going to get something drastically wrong because there's a new world order. There's a new actual, it isn't rewriting the global international order, which upholds peace, but it actually is going back to the drawing board of actually adhering to it, the global international order of right, wrong, even diplomacy. What does that mean?
Yeah, I think, John, there are some areas where I would say I think it's wrong, and I think we already know enough to say that it's wrong. And one of those areas, and you obviously have great expertise in this, having been to this region, having gone into Gaza and so forth, is the idea that after Turkey has continued to be a patron of Hamas, a patron of the Muslim Brotherhood, and as Qatar has served as essentially the bank for the ATM for Hamas for several years, for far too long. There should never have been a situation like that. After all of the blood that's been spilled of Israeli soldiers inside Gaza, after all of the war wounded, after everything that we went through on October the 7th, after all of the kidnappings and the hostage taking and the abductions, and our lives completely interrupted and fundamentally changed, incidentally, in some ways for the better, but in many, many ways for the worse. After all of that, somehow Turkey is going to be involved in the administering of the Gaza Strip. After all of that, somehow, Qatar is going to be involved in the administering of the Gaza Strip, according to the vision that has been spoken to by President Trump. I find that completely, totally, and utterly unacceptable. And I would say that Prime Minister Netanyahu has actually objected to this, but realizes that he can't necessarily remedy it. And that's the reason that the Prime Minister, who normally runs and holds on to the file of the United States-Israel relationship jealously, he holds on to it. His closest confidant was the erstwhile Minister for Strategic Affairs, Ron Dermer, somebody that I know that you know. And they hold on to it so jealously because they feel it's so very important, and also that they are able to master in the best way possible, not in the conspiratorial way, in the best way possible, that relationship, that they understand the nuances better than anybody else. And yet here we are with this foreboding sense that Turkey and Qatar are going to find themselves engaged in whatever takes place in the next phase inside the Gaza Strip. They are so convinced, the Prime Minister is so convinced that that is the reality, because that is the reality that Donald Trump seems to have chosen, that he's actually dispatched his Foreign Minister Gideon Saar, who I will say, with some degree of generosity, is a less than effective Foreign Minister, in no small part because the Prime Minister, for years, has really marginalized the Foreign Ministry, or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here in Israel. This is a completely unacceptable idea, and it absolutely does not cohere with the idea that Israel is going to go in and somehow finish the job inside Gaza. I mean, just today in Davos, President Trump said, and I'm quoting, with regard to Hamas, quote, they have to give up their weapons, and if they don't, it's going to be the end of them. Many countries have told me that we want to go in and do it. In other words, disarm Hamas. I don't think there are many countries who want to disarm Hamas at all. I think the only country that has any determination to disarm Hamas is Israel. And quite frankly, I think that our will and readiness to do that is a little bit on the wane. I wonder if you could just speak briefly, before we bring this conversation to a close. How ready and realistic do you think it is that the IDF is going to actually go in and finish off the job inside the Gaza Strip anytime soon, in the case that Turkey, Qatar are part of the border peace, and in the case that they're not?
Yeah, that's a great question. Really a so what aspect to the entire conversation. One on the Qatar and Turkey thing, again, being a part of the board of peace or other aspects of, yeah, accountability for past actions, but also wanting them in the room. Whether that's Qatar, and if you remember during the 20-point peace plan negotiations, Qatar was told to have Al Jazeera knock it off with the anti-Israel entire messaging, and it was an immediate change. And I think that U.S. administration and others like that capability of having somebody who, again, and even Qatar is a support housing of the Hamas, and they'll say, well, you asked us to do that, you being past administrations and others. So having them in the room, for me, accountable. I don't want, of course, Turkey, boots on the ground, which is actually an aspect of what does it mean, and then a charter which permanent administration, all of this. You're right. Since our last conversations, the ideals of what's called the International Stabilization Force has radically changed, as this is hard, right? Getting countries together and with a shared vision and understanding of what actually needs to happen on the ground. One, admit the reality of Hamas is not a member of anything, right? Which was really important to me and part of the beauty of the 20-point plan. No matter what any organization says, it says there is no such thing as Hamas in the future. It will not have a part in the governance. It will not have a, of course, it will not have weapons. And in point number 17, if they refuse anything that the plan moves forward, I think it is highly likely. And President Trump in the past a couple of weeks has also in his special way of talking does this where he may have another ultimatum about disarmament as even what was planned, I think, in the International Stabilization Force didn't, as this continues to go forward, didn't play out, whether that's a country saying, I will send troops. And now we're in this waiting pattern as these behind closed doors conversations of who's going to be a part, who's giving what. And I have been a fan of, you can have within the yellow zone, there's so much demining, tunnel destruction, clearing of rubble that needs to be done. And I think that that could actually be something that assists Israel in even getting to a point, but there is no other force that I believe that will actually be engaged in close combat with what is Hamas today, which is not what is Hamas October 6th, to convince them that they have no future, and that includes disarmament because you have to take the gun. I think it is highly likely that an ultimatum will be given. Hamas will refuse that ultimatum and will try to negotiate like it is with its mediators, Turkey, Qatar, and others, of withholding some type of weaponry, whether it's not big weapons or others, and that the IDF are preparing their plans and their multiple contingency planning of actually deploying forces to conduct operations in a very Israel way to start to do that disarmament piece by piece. It isn't adhering to a peace deal. Hamas didn't isn't in a peace deal. It was in a 20-point plan with all these other countries saying, look, you are going to be a part of this implementation of this plan. And that's really hard to see. But to answer your question quickly, highly likely, in my opinion, the IDF redeployed in close combat with Hamas to convince them to get to the point of complete disarmament. And the number one point of the 20-point fleet plan, which is the end goal that whether it's the peace board, the executive board, whatever, that Gaza will be a de-radicalized, demilitarized zone. That is the measure of what actions need to happen to make that happen in the near term so that we can start moving forward with step one is disarmament. But there's so much more to it. Who's going to be in charge of de-radicalization? I love the U.S. support to that UNRWA will have no role. So for me, that's more important than not having Turkey in some role in the Gaza future, is that UNRWA is not an organization that will step foot into Gaza as a part of the future of what Gaza in that region becomes.
Yeah, John, thank you very much for that response. I appreciate your perspective, as does everybody listening. You just on that last point, my huge concern and my enduring concern is that so much depends upon the whim and the will and the philosophy of the current administration, and of course the person who's at the helm of that administration. And I'm very fearful, and quite frankly, I'm convinced that once this administration concludes its time in office, which inevitably will be the case, whether it be sooner or later, that will happen, and there be a change to a different administration, that different administration can end up doing what we saw Biden do with regard to UNRWA after the Trump administration appropriately kneecapped UNRWA during the first Trump term, that we will actually see UNRWA re-ensconced inside the Gaza Strip under perhaps a future democratic administration. We don't know. It doesn't pay for us to dabble in prophecy, of course, as you and I have said throughout this conversation. But nothing seems to be certain, and I'm very, very worried that Israel will not have freedom of security, operational movement inside the Gaza Strip in the event that Turkey and Qatar, and frankly some others, are members of this board of peace. And so I think if Israel is going to go and tackle Hamas and is going to convince them to disarm completely, totally, and utterly, we'd better crack on with it, because I don't think that time is necessarily on our side as things stand in the current constellation. But it's moving all the time. You know, you and I podcasted about the International Stabilization Force. I don't think, incidentally, that its mission has evolved. I think its mission has largely disappeared. Very little talk about that stabilization force, but that wasn't to be foreseen when last we spoke. And now here we are. There is a board of peace. It was supposed to be predicated upon resolving and pushing through the vision of the 20-point plan that President Trump put forward. And now it's a replacement for international organizations. And I don't say that tongue in cheek. Time will tell. We will wait and see. But I do go back to my first mention of the Board of Peace, and I know that you may be loath to get into it, and I understand why, but I do stand by how I described it. As I look at that stage in Davos today, in my estimation, and I think I'm being quite generous in several of the cases, that is a B team of heads of state. That is not the team of heads of state that President Trump will have wanted to be flanked by. And actually, this flurry of invitations that's gone out really speaks to me about a desperate need almost to fill the seats, lest it should seem like an empty institution, like an empty organization. Now, there are reasons that people may be hesitating. I understand all of that. But, you know, the Europeans, John, they're so stuck in the mud. They're so unwilling to change their ways. President Trump, as an example, had to drag them by the nose to increasing their contribution to their own security in NATO, their financial contribution, because they just could not understand that there was finally somebody with a different philosophy on America's role when it came to international security within international organizations, including in NATO. So I don't know how swift they'll be to move on to the Board of Peace. I fear that they will not be too swift, but on the other hand, part of me says, who needs them anyway? They've not been particularly useful thus far, and they've got their own battles within their own borders for various reasons. John, thanks for letting me riff there. It's great to have you again. Where are you going on your travels? Anywhere interesting?
I am actually continuing some research in on the Nagorno-Karabakh wars. So I'll be
Ah,
actually in Armenia really soon, continuing my research, which is what we do. We learn every day, try to understand both the macro, but all the way down to that tactical when wars are happening. And I think this is what people are discounting in this historic moment from October 7th on, how much has truly happened both on the battlefields, but also in those diplomatic closed door meetings. The amount of change is so hard to keep up with, but I'm continuing my research across war zones around the world, and some have ended. And for this one, is actually true. Azerbaijan and Armenia ended a 30, 40 year really intensive war. So it actually gives hope to the future of many regions. For me, studying from Israel's Seven Front War to other wars going on, as you have this macro. And lastly, Benjamin, if you allow me, I think you're 100% to be concerned about the amount of work that can be done in the next 3 years, especially relating to the Middle East, relating to Gaza, but of course, there's Lebanon, there's other areas. And I think one of the things that the U.S. administration isn't throwing out, and the fact that there was actually a UN Security Council backing a resolution backing the 20-point plan is critical for the future, irrelevant of the current administration, is understanding the system that we live in on how things get done and what causes for longevity, and making sure that somebody is actually looking forward beyond the current administration. And I would say, even within Israel, beyond the current government, beyond the current situations, whether that's Syria, Lebanon, Gaza, I'm sure we'll have more conversations about in the future.
absolutely, we will, John, and thank you and safe travels. And thanks for all of your wonderful work, analysis, commentary, and scholarship. It's very much appreciated. So with that, I wish you a wonderful weekend. I don't think it sounds like it's going to be a restful weekend, but a wonderful weekend nonetheless. Always enjoy chatting to you, and I look forward to the next time we meet. Take care.